I'm Mike Koelemay, a senior manager in the enterprise AI and ML labs and consulting team.
And I'm Bruno Janota, and I lead the AI consulting team, which is an internal team that kind of supports all of our different lines of business with AI and ML use cases.
So we are both in a place in Lockheed Martin in enterprise operations called the Lockheed Martin AI Center, which has the mission of accelerating the adoption of AI across the Lockheed Martin business. We have three kind of core areas that central group addresses. One is called Foundations, where we build foundational capabilities with the focus on rapidly scaling things across the company. An innovations team that's focused on rapidly developing new artificial intelligence technologies, and an integration team that works with the first two teams to integrate those technologies into our business areas. So at Lockheed today, we're already using AI across basically every single business function in the enterprise and operations and on our missions. In the enterprise, we're using it on everything from like matching resumes and skills to job postings, to IT help tickets, to organize and prioritize them, and in programs like accelerating flight tests and things like that. In operations, we're using it to do things like optimize our manufacturing floors and factories. And of course, in our missions, our motto is "Your mission is ours." All of our customer programs, we're integrating AI as much as we can. Anything want to add to that?
No.
Cool. So our foundations team, like I said, is tasked with accelerating the adoption of AI across the company. And in that group, we're building a foundational ecosystem of tooling, processes, people, training to do that. Starting with a thing that we call AI Factory, which is an entire team that is focused on evaluating best-in-breed tooling from open source, commercial, and also building internal tooling to fill the gaps or where we feel like what's available isn't really adequate, and figuring out what is best in breed and what we can scale across Lockheed. We have some very unique challenges at Lockheed. I think in the commercial sector, the common pattern that I see is a centralization of resources, building centralized large data clusters and bringing people to that. At Lockheed, we almost have the inverse problem. We actually have that problem, and then we also have more problems. So we have a centralized instance that as many people that are able to use that, we want them to. We have tooling with thousands of users on it. But we also have hundreds of programs that work in environments that are completely disconnected from everything, and they need all the same tools. So we have to be able to essentially pick up the entire stack that we have running in a central place and then reproduce it in a whole bunch of places that have zero access to anything. So the AI Factory team has a strong focus on transferability, meaning that we can transfer all of the tooling to these other places, and also composability, meaning that we can piece together different stacks to meet different needs of different problems. And then some examples of things that we're doing. Bruno, you want to hit these?
Sure, yeah. So, in terms of that foundational ecosystem, our team in particular is taking those tools and actually helping the business areas, the business units, build out solutions, right? So an example with HR is a searchable database of skills, right? A lot of problems that you find are, you have these areas where it's difficult to hire, difficult to identify the right skill sets or combinations of skill sets. And for every employee, we have records of what recs they were hired into. We have records of what accomplishments they've had on programs, what programs they've supported. So building an entire pipeline to essentially extract skills and allow employees to go in and edit those skills and endorse other employees, and essentially managing that entire infrastructure using tools out of AI Factory as well as tools like Domino. Some other projects, so engineering flight test, accelerating the time it takes to analyze petabyte scale simulation data to understand anomalies, understand limitations in your system, or understand constraints. And then a few other projects where we're kind of trying to transform our quality organization to be more predictive and less reactive, and that leveraging tools or techniques like NLP or computer vision and baking those into a lot of our quality processes.
And in operations, One big program that we've been working on a lot is AI scheduling. So Lockheed builds a lot of different things. AI scheduling is all about optimizing the build sequence planning of our manufacturing facilities. So in those facilities, you have a lot of constraints. You have people, they have different skills, you have parts, all pretty common. And we have actually deployed today in multiple locations AI technologies that are helping optimize all of the factory floor management of the scheduling of all of those tasks on a daily basis. So basically what used to be a very manual task, people like shift managers would come in a couple hours before the shift. They would look at all the information that's available, generate a schedule for the day. People would come in and work. Is mostly automated now, where the manager just comes in right before the shift, looks at the schedule plan, makes a couple tweaks if they have to, and hits the go button. And lastly, on the mission side, this is one that's been in the news lately. We've been working on a collaboration with NVIDIA and several different fire services on what we call a cognitive mission manager. And so Lockheed, this is about wildland fire management. It turns out that we make a lot of platforms that you need to fight wildfires, ranging from UAVs with really awesome sensors that can see fires, to the H-60 Firehawks and C-130s that can drop water on them, and of course UAVs and satellites that can give you real-time imagery and other types of data. And so this project actually isn't about any of that because that already exists, but it's about using AI to coordinate the mission of doing firefighting in a more real-time manner. So today, the way that wildland fires are fought, there's a delay of usually up to several days from when you get data about where the fires are. They put them through these predictive models that were generated, I think in the 70s, if I remember correctly, to get a prediction of where they might be the next day, and then they go deploy resources. That takes a lot of time. The resources get there. With this, we can essentially do all of that in near real time and start deploying resources on the order of like minutes to hours instead of days.
All right, so the focus of this talk isn't what we've done, it's really what have we learned, right? So in deploying AI at scale across a bunch of different domains, we've tried to kind of pinpoint maybe 6 areas of challenges. And we kind of organize them into people, process, technology. And we have kind of a question that we're going to try to answer, or at least try to provide some guidance or some lessons learned along the way. So our first one is, how do you identify and retain talented AI ML engineers? There's been a couple of talks at the conference already on this topic, and we'll summarize some of the things that we've done that we think have been helpful in terms of helping with retention, as well as identifying the right skill sets. Between kind of people and process, we have, what does good collaboration on an AI ML team look like, right? So there's, a lot of teams are adopting Agile or using Agile, but certainly it's a little bit more difficult to do that in a data-driven kind of environment where you're learning as you go and you have ideas going into the problem, but you might not have the same hypotheses months later or weeks later as you get into different data sources. So we'll talk a little bit about what we've done to help with collaboration, both with our business partners and our engineering teams, as well as across our own engineering teams. We'll talk about how do we identify, plan, and execute on projects. We'll talk about some frameworks that we've used and a few kind of advice on different ways to structure those engagements. We'll talk on how to quickly get access to the right tools or hardware. So Domino plays a pretty pivotal role in that, and certainly many of you are aware of kind of the ease with which you can onboard folks into Domino. And then on the technology side, how do we consistently evaluate technology, especially as there's enterprise tools or open source tooling that solves very specific problems very well? How do you consistently evaluate, and what kind of buckets of problems should you be focusing on for AI ML solutions? And then lastly, we'll talk about how do we explore the solution space for a technical problem. So we'll talk about kind of an approach that we try to take and an approach that we've seen other teams take that can, in many cases, lead to maybe slower iteration time or slower deployment time.
One thing I'll add, since I don't think we hit on too well earlier, is just organizationally how we're structured. So we have data science and AI teams all over the company. They're on huge programs, like embedded in them. The business areas have their own AI and data science teams. And we sit in a centralized group, again, with the intent of helping scale AI across the company. So the consulting team that Bruno runs, the goal of that team is to help any other team in Lockheed improve what they're currently doing. And that could mean anything from they're not doing anything with machine learning and they're wondering if maybe they should be. So we do different engagements with different teams across the company. So in that case, we would go in, look at what their problem is, and help them determine whether or not they should consider bringing it on. All the way to teams that are way down the path of AI. They've built super sophisticated models, and maybe they just want somebody else to come in and look at what they're doing and say, are we doing this the right way? Is it the best way to do it? How do we take this to production? We've never done that before. So our central team goes out and helps all of those teams kind of take the next step. And our goal is to help teach them and then get out, or build a team and then get out. But we're not in the business of doing long-term engagements or trying to like centralize the data science work across Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great context for kind of our hybrid model, which is one of the things we'll talk about, right? So in terms of finding and retaining talent, optimizing the pipeline, right? So I've seen and have participated in lots of interview cycles where you have a take-home assignment or you have maybe 5-6 rounds of interviews. And certainly when you're competing for top talent, the longer you draw out that process, the more work you put on the candidate, I think the more likely you either end up in a scenario where they have multiple offers at that point and it's much harder to get them to actually join. So optimizing not just like the compensation component, but even the experience of going through the interview, right? So how do you condense the interview to learn as much as possible about the candidate, both technically and behaviorally and culturally, without burdening them so much that they're kind of disengaging as you get into the interview process? And some of the things that we try to do is both retain talent that isn't just very strong technically, but is aligned to our mission, right? So like a specific thing we do is we try to ask a question to learn about like what's their interest in aerospace and defense beyond maybe working on interesting problems, right? So a specific question that we like to ask, and we have kind of a handful of different ones, is if you had the next year, unlimited budget, unlimited access to whatever data set you wanted to work on, what would you do and why, right? And that's a hard question to say like, some very generic, like computer vision's really cool and I think object detection would be fun. But the really good candidates will stick out and say, well, I think the heads-up display for the F-35 is so cool. And I would love to like help inform them and give them more operational insight into a particular mission area, right? So trying to tease out those types of questions. And another one is like when you're looking for a technical candidate, you can ask a very pointed question like, what would you do for explainability of a gradient boosted tree decision model? But like, the alternative might be, what's the most difficult technical challenge you've worked on in the last 2 months, right? And you're going to learn about what they've actually had hands-on experience doing technically from that question a lot more than whether they can answer a very pointed question that maybe they don't have experience in or maybe they have surface knowledge of, but like have the capability or capacity to learn a lot more if they needed to, given the context. So really trying to optimize like the entire process, and in our case, like we can condense, in 3 interviews, all of the things that we might accomplish in maybe a full day or a half day on-site interview. So really trying to optimize that process for bringing in talent and bringing in not only the right talent that's aligned to the mission, but also aligned technically. We've also seen lots of teams try to start AI groups or start machine learning teams or data science teams. And what we've found is that, hiring someone right out of college or someone very junior and they're a lone wolf in the organization, they don't have technical leadership, they don't have the mentorship, within 18 months, they're usually looking for other jobs or other roles, right? So starting with an experienced hire if you're at that point where you're trying to make your first hire, but also starting with the right hire, right? So if you're a research group and you care a lot about that academic rigor, like starting with an academic leader might be a great place to start. But if you're an applied ML group and you're looking for somebody that can very quickly pivot from an NLP to a computer vision project, starting with somebody that has had that experience in maybe a center of excellence type environment where they've worked on a lot of different projects is a much more effective way to start. And then structuring your organization. So, in our case, we're a hybrid model. So we have our center of excellence. And, in our interview cycle, we're able to kind of think about what are the 2 or 3 big differentiators about our group that would entice or interest candidates that would want to work on a variety of projects or work with, different types of data, for example. And I think having that hybrid structure where you have a center of excellence, but you also have very, very laser focused team is a way that like if you get a candidate that comes in and their resume indicates some level of experience in different areas, but you find that, hey, they have really, really deep experience in computer vision and we have a group that specializes in that. So they might not be a good fit for our group, which is going to focus a lot more on different types of problems, but they might be a great fit for some other group in your org. And I think having that flexibility is really, really nice to have both kind of the centralized model as well as forward deployed teams that are focused in specific domains. And then lastly is creating a great culture. Certainly there's a bunch of different ways to do that. We kind of subscribe to like Netflix's feedback model, the 4 A's, if you've heard of it, which is aim to assist, your feedback should be actionable, and your feedback should always kind of lead to either an acceptance or at least an acknowledgement by the people that you're working with. So we're pretty heavy on feedback, daily, weekly, versus kind of waiting for one-on-ones or waiting for performance reviews for that feedback. In many cases, when we have quarterly or semi-annual performance reviews, like nothing is a surprise because we're very actively talking about projects. We're talking about our successes. We're talking about failures. Accountability, I think, especially when you have cross-functional teams and you have a lot of dependencies on different people accomplishing different tasks to unblock, downstream things. Certainly everybody being accountable is very, very critical. So we kind of foster that culture of like autonomy and independence, but also accountability. And then continuous learning, there's a bunch of different ways at Lockheed. One of our groups is called the Aiml Labs group, and they're focused on training and upskilling and all of the different things that you might want from a continuous learning perspective. And I think in this domain, you kind of have to have that as part of your day-to-day. So like within our team, we have some overhead budget for doing things like reading papers and having paper groups and having hackathons and all these kinds of things that I think entice folks to continuously learn and get out of maybe execution mode, right? So certainly on scoped projects, you might get very deep into like we have to execute and deliver this in this timeline. And then you have other opportunities to, I think, do a lot of that exploration informally and with your team. And then lastly, I think having all the pieces together. So I've seen lots of data organizations where you don't have anybody that can do the front end ETL work, right? And you are just constrained in many different ways to like force your team to wear many hats when they don't have that skill set or that deep interest. Or you don't have technical leaders that are scoping projects appropriately, and the expectations between the engineering team and the business are mismatched. So I think it's having all of the different pieces to a successful organization that are really, really key in making sure that everybody's happy that's part of that organization.
So another thing that we do, so this is for people in process, is that we have a group that's dedicated, it's part of our AI Center team of Agile coaches that are focused on helping all of our consulting engagements and all the other teams in our Lockheed Martin AI Center operate in the most agile way possible. And it's very much not prescriptive, so you might say like, are we using Kanban or something like that? And it's not. Every single one of them goes into every engagement and figures out what processes they should be using that maximizes the effectiveness of the group for that particular problem. This has been particularly useful to have this like functional group of Agile coaches because they can share knowledge that they learn from executing one project in one part of Lockheed Martin with the other Agile coaches that are doing similar projects in other parts of Lockheed Martin. So we found that having this group of coaches that help us facilitate the culture, the process, and the tools that we're using on the programs has been extremely effective at helping them run more quickly and promoting the culture that we're trying to have.
Yeah, absolutely. The next one is identifying, planning, and executing on the right projects. So I think one of the keynote speakers yesterday talked about like really doing a deep dive on the value up front and trying to quantify the value of the project. And that starts with asking the right questions. So these are like two pretty common frameworks. The first is a Domino reference that you can download. It's they call it the pre-flight project checklist. And there's a lot of really great questions that you can ask up front that help scope not just the amount of engineering effort that goes into it, but also what the form factor is. This team ready to adopt this change? Like what are all the other pieces that need to be in place for this project to be successful beyond the technology, right? And CrispDM is another pretty common process. They have like a whole business understanding section of like, here's all these things that you should understand, not just the, the volume of the data, but the variety and what other data sources might we need, or what other data sources might we care about from procuring externally even to like make this project more effective. So it starts with, I think, asking the right questions, and then it transitions to having the right framework, right? So can you break down this big project into a pilot project that can demonstrate proof of value, right? So we have something we call the Runway Process, but it's essentially, our team has a huge backlog of potential projects that we could pursue, and we have to try to figure out which ones are worth doing and which ones should we try to figure out alternatives or alternative teams that might be able to execute. And we have this kind of flight test process where we have a little loop and a big loop. And the idea in the little loop is, do we have enough information to, in the next week or in the next couple days, understand the feasibility, the viability, and the potential ROI of a project like this, right? So if we already have access to the data, getting the right people with the right questions and the right tools to get into that data and understand the possibility of predicting the target outcome. And then graduating from that little loop into a larger project.
Guys, add one thing. So the small loop is where a lot of projects end, just to be clear, because a lot of people want to do things with AI that once you realize what they're trying to do, they don't have the right data, they don't have the right processes, they don't have the right people or tools. And that small loop is critical to identifying that stuff early and before you start some big engagement. Again, and a lot of times people have data and they're like, well, I have, I don't know, some kind of data and I want to do this thing with it and I should be able to do that. But once you dig into the data, there's data quality problems or you're missing this data. It's like all this stuff and it's like you can't do that. Our recommendation in all of those cases are what things they need to fix so that they can then move forward doing the project. So they might go back and fix their data sources. They might add new data sources to it and use that money to do that instead of doing an engagement with us and then reach us back out to us later to continue.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll say the critical point is that like we're not so stuck on a single project and trying to just move that for weeks or months. It's really understanding in that little loop enough to gather both the business investment and the interest in pursuing the big loop, right? And we essentially have different structures, right? So if we're doing something, in a few days, I think there's the total freewheeling aspect of just give someone a data set and have them work it. But I think there's other problems that arise from that, where you either end up in a path that's not productive, or you kind of iteratively keep trying things for weeks on end until you try to get to a solution and you never really get there. So we still think some planning or some form of like a Kanban type execution for Little Loop is very useful. And then there's a handful of different execution frameworks for larger projects that are cross-functional and have maybe larger development teams where you have very structured deliverables, very structured schedules, very structured execution timelines, and I think being able to be flexible on both and being okay with failing in the Little Loop, right? Like being okay with the outcome being a set of recommendations for how you might be able to do this under these conditions, and then prioritizing the things that show a lot of promise early on. So another one is kind of frictionless access to AI tools and hardware, right? So a lot of times the challenge is you have the data, you have everything, but you can't do it all locally, for example. And Domino's been a very useful tool for us to be able to, in your first week, have you training deep learning models, or within just a few days, getting you into a project where all of the environment variables are there, all of the access is there, the hardware is flexible and elastic. So all of that serves us quite well. I think we have over 1,000 users of Domino across the enterprise, and there's many, many places where we've been able to move quickly because we've been able to get them access to the right tooling.
Speaking of tooling, I'll hit this again. I may have said too much earlier, but so AI Factory, again, is the team that we have that's constantly evaluating best-in-breed tooling across the entire AI lifecycle. What I can add to that is that starts down from everything from compute and infrastructure all the way out to edge deployment. So we have hardware engineers. We have people that are working on infrastructure as code for deploying Kubernetes clusters, because again, it's all about transferability and being able to pick things up and drop them pretty much anywhere. out to the ML ops, data ops, and infra ops toolings that you need to do all of that stuff. It includes things like AI security, explainability, pretty much everything. Edge deployment for us gets really interesting because of all the different hardware that we run on, including like custom hardware, super constrained environments. So doing things like model optimization and getting the most out of your model on really small hardware form factors is really important. And having this framework allows us to do those tool evaluations in one place rather than having teams across the entire company doing all of their own evaluations, coming to different conclusions, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Different people have different needs, but it allows us, at least as an enterprise, to have some opinions about what we think are the best in breed tools for certain types of applications and give all of those teams a starting point rather than everybody doing it themselves.
Awesome. And then the last one that we have is don't chase technology. So given a use case, so a leader in quality figures out that we're spending hours and hours trying to document defects, and we want to know if AI ML can help, right? So that's a pretty common use case that dozens of quality leaders at our company have asked us and have asked their teams. And there's different approaches you can take, right? So approach 1 and approach 2. I've seen many teams go toward approach 2. And they're like, all right, so the primary data source is text. And if I go on papers with code and I look at text classification, Roberta or ExcelNet or something are proving state-of-the-art performance on IMDb. So we should try that. And then you find weeks down the road, you're tinkering with different things. You're finding that the vocabulary is so different between the reference performance on some other data set and your own data set. And you're chasing technology to try to get state-of-the-art performance before you've even proved that it's viable. So we always kind of start with approach 1. So we have good baselines for every kind of problem, essentially. So given this problem, you might start with TF-IDF and logistic regression, and within a few hours, hyperparameter tune it and figure out what's our likely performance threshold, right? And the challenge is with open source data sets or Kaggle type data sets, you kind of have a very good understanding of how well you can perform based on other industry benchmarks. With a lot of internal data sets, you don't really know how predictable something is until you get into it, depending on maybe the intuition or the business context of should it be very easy to predict? Intuitively, you might think yes, and then you get into the data and you confirm that. But with good baselines, you can very quickly, within a few hours, understand, is this possible or not? And then iteratively improve on that. So there's a great article out of Carnegie Mellon where they kind of talk about baselines, and they talk about even in the literature, there's a lot of published research that is comparing to a baseline that's not optimized, right? So they're comparing maybe to a pre-trained architecture with no fine-tuning. And I think having strong baselines is so critical to be able to move quickly and to be able to get the right buy-in from your project stakeholders to move to later stages, right? And the other thing that baselines kind of help with is if you have good performance out of a baseline and you get to that performance very quickly, you can start doing all of the other downstream things, like building your microservice framework or integrating with the business system or doing all these things that might actually end up being the most difficult part of your project. But you can start to do some of that while iteratively improving on the actual source model. So don't chase technology is another big one that we kind of encourage in our culture. And in terms of key takeaways, so again, for the couple of people, process, technology things we've been talking about, so creating the right culture and treating people well, fostering collaboration and really focusing on agility. In terms of process, like focus on the right projects and execute on them really well. Find the right tools and automate everything else. So we have, even with Domino, we've done some automation things that make it, much quicker to get somebody spun up or get accounts created or get, the right permissions or the right hardware tiers available to them. In terms of technology, we have an entire org that's never not evaluating new technology prospects. We have a tech radar for any new package or any new library or any new enterprise tool. And we have the visibility to see what's being incubated, what's in a sandbox, what's available today, and a way to communicate that with the entire ML community at Lockheed. And then lastly, always start with a baseline model. There's tried and true techniques that I think are a great starting point. And then certainly there's a lot of ways to improve on that, but I think getting too caught up in the research is often an inhibitor for many teams to get the right level of buy-in. And with that, don't know exactly how we're doing on timing, so we'll open it up to any questions.
There's a mic coming for you.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. It covers a lot of ground, but I want to double click on the agility. Could you speak about what type of tweaks do you find most effective in tweaking the standard technology?
We can hear you.
Yeah, we could hear you.
Yeah. Maybe.
So what?
What kind of tweaks did you do to the process?
Yeah, like from project to project.
Yeah, to make it more suitable for ML teams. Thank you.
So yeah, so I'll say I think there's a number of different things that can come up. So there's like one example from like the Data Science Project Management Institute is like data-driven Scrum, where you maybe have fixed timelines, but you're not planning 3 months out, right? So we have kind of release processes in some projects where we're looking at what are we doing in Q1, and there's other projects where we're in a much more experimental phase and we're not trying to plan as far out. So there's some things like that our agility coaches have come in and said, hey, like based on where you're at, I think you should be planning in 1 month cycles, right? Or instead of 2-week sprints, maybe 1-week sprints. So there's kind of modifications to the existing process, but I think there's also, do you have the right framework to have visibility into what everyone is actually doing at a level that's useful, right? So I've seen teams go the other way of like, we have Jira and we feel like we have to use every feature, for example, and we have to like plan our stories, but also plan our subtasks. We have to use the exact Fibonacci sequence for estimating points. And all of those things, I think in some cases can slow you down versus speed you up, right? So our agility coaches are in the trenches with dozens of different projects that are very research oriented, working directly with programs, working with multiple business areas, working with multiple ML teams that report up through different structures. And their goal is to really try to optimize for this project, what's the best way to make you agile? And
so the tweaks are along the lines of it's that balance. Do you have too much process or too little process in order to optimize your speed? And so you can make those tweaks by saying, like, instead of using Fibonacci and doing all of this planning, let's maybe take one step back from that and like not estimate story points and just see how much we can get done every week and see how everybody feels about that. Or it might be like, Jira is way overkill for this. Why don't we just use GitLab issues or just use like a Kanban like task tracker? And that's exactly what the coaches are in there. They're on all the programs, looking at what the processes are and kind of saying, this is too much, this is not enough.
Hey, thanks for all the useful info. Can you confirm, so you do the baseline in the little loop? And then I'll squeeze a second question as also the makeup of the larger engagements with your teams. Is that like cross-functional? You've got everyone end-to-end in the stack, and does that come from a mixture of the units and your centralized team?
yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so I would say the baseline should usually happen in the little loop. Before you try transformers, I think you should always try a baseline and compare to that. And I would say the important thing with the baseline is not just like I'm using all the default parameters out of the box and here's how it works. It's like, you've thought through some hyperparameter tuning, and because it was, a more straightforward model, you can actually do some tuning up front to get some reasonable performance, right? So definitely part of the little loop, definitely part of the feasibility stage for kind of scoping out a project. On the second question, I forgot what it was. It was the do we have all the components of a project? Like, do we have like data engineers, data scientists, ML engineers, product managers, business folks all within our central org, or do we have them kind of distributed and we're
So it depends on the engagement, obviously, and the scale of it, because some of them are very small, where we might have like half of one person's time focused on it, and maybe it's just focused on building a machine learning model and deploying it. Or it might be a bigger engagement. Our team is almost primarily machine learning engineers. We also have some data engineers. And if an engagement requires more cross-functional support, there are other teams that we can pull in from. So for example, we sit next to the Chief Data and Analytics Office. They have a huge quantity of data engineers. If the program that we're getting involved with during that small loop, another thing that happens is we find out that really what people have is a data engineering problem, not a machine learning problem. We'll hand that off to the Chief Data and Analytics Office. They can get involved, help them clean up all the data, then pull us back in. So we pull in resources if needed, but they don't come. Actually, the Agile coaches are the only ones that come out of our group from a cross-functional perspective.
Yeah, I would say a majority of our projects, I think we usually have, cross-functional teaming to kind of execute on projects. So.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. My question is more about the ownership post. So does it stay with your guys' central team? How do you monitor that the model is actually being used properly? And how do you make sure that the end user or the business unit doesn't just let it go or doesn't use it properly or need maintenance? How do you do that part of this whole process?
Yeah, either one.
I think the easy answer, so our general goal on the consulting team is not to be involved long term. So we want to teach them how to deploy a model and monitor it and get the necessary expertise and tooling on their team to do that. And then we get out if at all possible. I think there are some scenarios where we're involved a little bit longer. Maybe they can't hire the expertise or they're not able to upskill someone. But generally speaking, we're not trying to be in those loops if at all possible.
Yeah, and I'll say I think there's definitely both sides. So we've had some projects where we've sustained and maintained the code base for multiple years, and we have some where we've been able to help them hire someone with that skill set, and they've taken over kind of the extension or any iterative improvements or scaling that technology to other areas potentially. But our ultimate goal is to we can't scale ourselves, right? We can't grow our team to 1,000+ people and solve every ML problem at Lockheed. But what we can do is we can help other teams grow and help other teams stand up the right skill sets to do it. So a lot of times we might build a proof of concept, help scale it, get it into deployment, get the right monitoring solutions in place to understand that it's working well over time, and then help them hire and actually help them with the interviews, help them with the onboarding, help them with kind of scoping maybe what 2 or 3 other projects they can do beyond that initial one that we built out is. So we've done a lot of that in terms of organization building as well.
And a key nuance there is that we're a cost to the company. We don't make money from our engagements like a traditional consulting company would. So the business areas pay for an engagement, but it's basically at cost. And then it actually costs us more than that because we need overhead to sustain our team, do training, and all of that. So unlike a traditional consulting company model, we don't make money. We're a cost to the business. We can't scale our team for as much business as we can get. The more business we get, the more expensive our team gets to the company.
Quick question about the little loop. Whenever you have projects that fail out of that, need massive data overhauls or things like that, how many businesses are all right, well, never mind, I'm just not going to do this AI thing, versus how many actually follow through with the recommendations that y'all provide?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say it depends on the group, obviously. So we've had some groups where they're invested. They want to learn how to do ML better, right? And for them, they're just they're impressed at how quickly you could go from raw data to something that is informative or actionable. But yeah, I would say across our company, I think we have a pretty data-driven culture. So I would say most of the time when we make recommendations, they don't fall flat. But it certainly happens from time to time. And for us, I think that's a good early indicator of is this customer, is this group invested in the long-term sustainability of a solution, right? Because I think a lot of times they're very interested in hey, it'd be great if I could put a camera here and help automate this inspection. And then you kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how likely is this to succeed? What data do we need, et cetera? And then they disengage, or that maybe they saw a really compelling demo from a vendor and they're well, this doesn't look like that, right? And sometimes that's a good thing, right? Because we'd rather work with partners that are just as invested as we are in making it successful. Right, because I think that last mile of getting users to adopt it, getting users to understand how it works, getting people to also get behind the technology, is in some cases like everything else is in line. You have the data, you have the funding, you have everything else, but then you don't have the adoption that you expected or anticipated. And a lot of times in the little loop, we're able to kind of like assess how good of a partner they might be in a year, multi-year type engagement.
Hi, thanks. So how do you take like a given ML product that you've developed and get it to have more user adoption across the company?
Yeah.
So I think probably one primary mechanism for that is our Aiml Labs team. It's AI and machine learning labs. We have a website that kind of acts as a central virtual hub for all of our practitioners across Lockheed Martin in AI and ML. So it's a website. People can post content there. You can post blogs there. You can go there. You can search for people that have skills in this area. You can connect with the consulting team there. And that's really the central hub for doing that type of thing. So if you created a model and you wanted more people across the company to do it, you would certainly go post it there. You'd post it on our Slack channels. Those are the places I would start.
Yeah,
I would make us aware of it, like the central team, because we can help advocate for people using it.
Yeah, and I would say the more local approach, right? So if I built an application that maybe makes it possible to identify anomalies in like simulation data, right? I think understanding like what are the personas, like who are the potential users of this up front, right? So a lot of times you're like working with a director, you're working with somebody that has access to funding, they're framing a problem for you, and then you go and try to build a solution, and they haven't, like they can't easily produce a list of here's the 50 people I think should use it, right? And then you build it, and then you get like 3 or 4 users, and they kind of trickle in and out, and they don't get the level of adoption that you like. So for us, a lot of times when we're getting out of that little loop and we're seeing that there's like some initial success that we should capitalize on, we're also trying to do a bigger kind of kickoff where we're pulling in the various users to understand like, are there 4 or 5 different like user profiles that might benefit from this tool? And does that initial capability we've scoped, does that actually meet all of their needs? Or is it only going to meet like this one subset? Right, so I think identifying your power users up front, because ultimately they're going to be the best advocates for anything you build. Right, so if I'm building something that's like point and click, point it to some location, there's going to be a bunch of data in that location, and then there's going to be an interface for identifying anomalies in that data or navigating it in some way. Like, I'm not going to be the person advocating as heavily as this person that actually finds it useful and can point to specific ways that it helped them. Right, so I think partnering with your users early on and really taking their feedback in the scoping process and the initial kind of development process is something that we found really successful for getting like dozens or hundreds of users, right? So I think creating that like sense of ownership in the process. So I think there's times where you can come in and we have this grand plan, we have this scheduling, we got funding, we talk to your director, here's what we're trying to build. Without their input, they don't feel like, I think you're pushing technology to them versus jointly developing it. So I think trying to get your potential users integrated as early as possible, but also trying to avoid the scenario of like a dozen cooks in the kitchen all trying to build something different. So it's a delicate balance, but I think in most cases it's really like getting those power users in the room with the team as we're developing it. And then we've even done some things where like we've built a product in quality, for example, that's being used across 10 different locations. So for every location, we have like a site lead, and they've been engaged heavily in not just the, I'll say, championing of that product within their teams, but also in pulling out feedback from users and communicating that with us so we can prioritize it. So I think like, when you have a slide and you're presenting some outbrief of your project, like putting the business team and all the tech POCs that supported you and putting them right up alongside the developers is, a good way to kind of get that shared ownership and that shared motivation to like make it successful. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, another question. So what's been your experience of how long Little Loop should last, and does that get paid or charged back to the customer or the business unit?
Yeah. So we kind of have an operating model of like, we do like inner business area exchanges. Like if we think a project is 200,000, like we'll do that, funding exchange to our business area. But our team is kind of assuming a 20% or so overhead for operating the team and for doing little loops, for doing some things to kind of gather requirements and scope. So, and I think that that's really useful because, it's difficult to like talk to somebody about a great idea and then say, I want to keep having this conversation, but we need a funding model to do it, right? So a lot of times, depending on the problem, a lot of times we can do the little loop on our overhead, for example, and maybe not do a full chargeback. But there's other cases where, depending on the complexity of the problem, like we might scope the little loop to be a 2 or 3 week experiment where there is some useful outcome, right? So it might not be a deployed model in 2 or 3 weeks, but it might be an MVP model and a series of recommendations for a phase 2 deployment or something like that. So I think in our case, like we have the right funding model to like keep our team structured in a way where we're flexible to be able to engage with the business and maybe even do some development on overhead. But still kind of prioritizing the end goal being an outcome from a little loop that's useful, and then either transitioning it to a big loop or identifying what kind of next steps would be needed. And then I don't know if I answered the full question. You had a question, I think. Yeah. So I'll say it depends. There's some cases where the data is there, getting access to it is very straightforward. Like in many cases, we might already have access to it because we've worked with this team or this group in the past. So if all the things are in place where we can very quickly get access to the data and it's in a reasonable state, I think less than 3 days is the ideal goal. But there are some cases where there's kind of other hurdles you have to get through to really get the right data to be able to model with. And in those, I think less than a month is usually the goal. But depending on how complicated it is, you might vary on that.